Maria had been living her dream life on her beautiful 50-acre ranch for 15 wonderful years. Every morning, she would wake up to the sound of birds chirping and her horses neighing softly in the distance. This wasn't just any ordinary property. It was her family's legacy, passed down through 3 generations of hard work and love. Her grandfather had bought this land way back in the 1960s, when everything around here was just empty fields and rolling hills. Back then, you could drive for miles without seeing another house. He was a smart man who saw something special in this piece of earth. The land had everything: gentle slopes, natural springs, and rich soil, perfect for raising animals and growing crops. Maria remembered visiting this ranch as a little girl during summer vacations. Her grandfather would lift her up onto his shoulders and walk around the property, pointing out different trees and telling her stories about the land. He taught her how to care for horses, how to fix fences, and most importantly, how much this place meant to their family. When he passed away, he left everything to Maria because he knew she loved the ranch as much as he did. Over the years, Maria had put her heart and soul into making the ranch even better. She restored the old farmhouse brick by brick, keeping all the original charm but adding modern comforts. The wooden porch where her grandfather used to sit and drink his morning coffee was still there, and she kept his old rocking chair in the exact same spot. She built new stables for her 6 horses, each one designed with plenty of space and natural light. The pastures were green and healthy, surrounded by perfectly maintained wooden fences that she painted white every spring. But the world around Maria's ranch had changed dramatically. What used to be quiet countryside was now a bustling suburban area. Developers had discovered this beautiful region and started building everywhere. The biggest change came 5 years ago when they built Oakwood Heights, a fancy housing development right next door to her property. Oakwood Heights wasn't just any regular neighborhood. These were expensive homes with perfectly manicured lawns, stone driveways, and elaborate landscaping. Each house looked like it belonged in a magazine. The development had its own community center, a beautiful building with large windows and modern architecture that served as the headquarters for their homeowners association. At first, Maria actually enjoyed having neighbors. The families who moved in were mostly nice people, successful professionals, retirees, and young couples starting their lives together. Some of them were curious about ranch life and would stop by to ask questions about her horses. Maria was always happy to chat, and even invited a few neighbors to go horseback riding on her trails. The kids especially loved seeing the animals, and Maria enjoyed sharing her knowledge about caring for horses. For the first few years, everything was peaceful. Maria kept her property looking absolutely perfect. She mowed the areas near the road, kept her fences in excellent condition, and made sure her horses were always well-groomed and healthy. She even planted flowers along her front fence to make the entrance to her ranch more beautiful. The neighbors seemed to appreciate having such a well-maintained property next door. The Homeowners Association in Oakwood Heights had been formed shortly after the development was completed, but Maria never worried about it. Her ranch had been there long before any of these houses existed, so she figured their rules didn't apply to her. The HOA mostly focused on things like making sure people didn't paint their houses weird colors or leave their garbage cans out too long. Maria's daily routine was simple and satisfying. She would wake up early, feed her horses, and check on all the animals. Then she would walk around the property, looking for any repairs that needed to be done, or just enjoying the peaceful morning air. In the afternoons, she would often ride one of her horses through the trails that wound through her land. Sometimes neighbors would wave from their yards and she would wave back with a friendly smile. The ranch wasn't just Maria's home, it was her sanctuary. After working her regular job in town during the week, she would come home to this peaceful place where she could forget about deadlines and stress. On weekends, she would spend hours working in her vegetable garden or simply sitting on the porch, reading a book while listening to the sounds of nature. Everything started to change when the HOA elected a new board president. His name was Robert Stone, and he was very different from the previous president. Robert was a retired lawyer who had recently moved to Oakwood Heights from the city. He had very strong opinions about how the neighborhood should look, and he wasn't shy about sharing those opinions with everyone. Within just a few weeks of Robert taking over, Maria started noticing changes in the neighborhood. The HOA began sending out more frequent newsletters with longer lists of rules. They started having more meetings, and Maria could sometimes hear raised voices coming from the community center during these gatherings. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when Maria found an official-looking envelope in her mailbox. It was addressed to her with certified mail stamped in red letters across the front. Maria's heart sank a little as she opened it. Inside was a formal complaint from the Oakwood Heights HOA. The letter claimed that her horses were making too much noise during the day, and that her property's rural appearance was bringing down property values in the neighborhood. Maria read the letter 3 times, hardly believing what she was seeing. Her horses were quiet, well-behaved animals that spent most of their time peacefully grazing in the pasture, and her property was beautiful and well-maintained. She took pride in keeping everything in perfect condition. Maria sat down at her kitchen table and wrote a polite response explaining that her ranch had been there long before the development was built. She mentioned that she wasn't a member of their HOA and that she had always tried to be a good neighbor. She even invited Mr. Stone to visit her property any time to see for himself how well-maintained everything was. But instead of resolving the issue, Maria's polite response seemed to make things worse. More letters started arriving, each one more demanding than the last. What had started as a simple misunderstanding was quickly turning into something much more serious, and Maria began to worry about what might happen next. What started as a simple complaint letter quickly turned into something Maria never expected. Robert Stone wasn't satisfied with her polite response. Instead of accepting that her ranch wasn't part of his HOA, he seemed to take it as a personal challenge. Within 2 weeks of Maria's reply, another certified letter arrived in her mailbox. This time, the complaint was even more ridiculous. The HOA claimed that her horses were creating excessive noise pollution between the hours of 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. Maria couldn't help but laugh when she read this. Her horses spent most of their day quietly eating grass and occasionally snorting, or neighing softly to each other. They were probably quieter than most people's dogs or lawnmowers. The letter also complained that her barn was architecturally inconsistent with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Maria stared at her beautiful red barn with its classic design and white trim. Her grandfather had built it in the traditional style, and she had lovingly maintained it over the years. It was one of the most photographed buildings in the area, with tourists often stopping to take pictures of the picturesque scene. But Robert wasn't finished. The third complaint really made Maria angry. The HOA claimed that her gravel driveway was creating dust pollution that was affecting air quality in the neighborhood. Maria walked out to look at her driveway, which she had recently had resealed and was in perfect condition. On windy days, there might be a tiny bit of dust, but certainly no more than what came from the construction sites that were constantly being built around the area. Each letter came with a fine attached. The first fine was $50. The second was $100. The third was $200. Even though Maria knew she didn't owe these fines, seeing the amounts kept growing made her stomach twist with worry. She had worked hard for her money, and the idea of paying for complaints that made no sense felt completely unfair. Maria decided to attend the next HOA meeting to try to clear things up in person. She put on her nicest dress and drove over to the community center on a Thursday evening. The meeting room was packed with about 30 neighbors, most of whom she recognized from seeing around the area. When Robert called for new business, Maria stood up and politely introduced herself. She explained that she had received several complaint letters and wanted to clarify that her ranch wasn't part of the HOA, since it had existed long before the development was built. She kept her voice calm and friendly, hoping to resolve the misunderstanding, but instead of listening, Robert interrupted her. He stood up and started talking about how certain properties in the area were bringing down everyone's home values. He didn't mention Maria by name, but everyone in the room knew exactly who he was talking about. He showed before and after photos of other properties that had been improved to meet HOA standards, making it clear what he thought should happen to Maria's ranch. Several neighbors nodded along as Robert spoke. Maria felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment as she realized that people she had waved to for years were now looking at her like she was some kind of problem that needed to be solved. A few people even clapped when Robert finished his presentation. After the meeting, Maria tried to talk to some of her neighbors individually, but most of them seemed uncomfortable and hurried away. One woman she had chatted with many times at the mailbox actually crossed the street to avoid her. Maria drove home feeling confused and hurt. How had she gone from being a friendly neighbor to being treated like an enemy? The situation got worse over the next few weeks. Robert had started a newsletter that went out to all the residents in Oakwood Heights. Maria wasn't supposed to receive it since she wasn't part of the HOA, but a kind neighbor secretly gave her a copy. She was shocked to see that the entire front page was dedicated to property maintenance issues in the area, with several photos that were clearly taken of her ranch from different angles. The newsletter talked about properties that were incompatible with our community standards and urged residents to report any violations they observed. It even included a phone number for people to call with complaints. Maria realized that Robert was encouraging her neighbors to spy on her and report back to him. Soon, Maria started noticing changes in how people treated her. When she went to the local feed store where she had been shopping for years, the conversation seemed to stop when she walked in. At the grocery store, people who used to smile and chat would look away when they saw her. Even the mailman, who had always been friendly, now just left her mail without saying hello. The complaints kept coming, each one more absurd than the last. The HOA claimed that her horses were a fire hazard because they ate grass, potentially creating dry conditions. They said her wooden fences were unsafe because they weren't made of the same vinyl material used in the development. They even complained that her roosters were waking people up, despite the fact that Maria didn't own any roosters. By now, the fines had added up to over $1,000. Maria knew she didn't legally owe any of this money, but the constant stream of official-looking letters was starting to wear her down. She began to wonder if maybe there was some new law she didn't know about. Maybe the city had changed the rules and somehow given the HOA authority over her property. The breaking point came when Maria found Robert standing in her driveway one Saturday morning, taking pictures of her property with a professional camera. When she asked what he was doing, he claimed he was documenting violations for legal purposes. The way he said it made Maria's blood run cold. That evening, Maria sat in her grandfather's old study, surrounded by boxes of papers and documents. She felt overwhelmed and alone. The place that had always been her sanctuary now felt like it was under attack. She wondered if her grandfather had ever faced anything like this, and what he would have done in her situation. As she looked through the old papers, Maria realized she needed to understand exactly what her legal rights were. Tomorrow, she decided, she would start fighting back. Maria thought things couldn't get any worse, but she was wrong. After weeks of constant complaints and growing fines, Robert Stone decided to take the most extreme step possible. He convinced the HOA board to hire a law firm that specialized in property disputes. This wasn't just about neighbor complaints anymore. This was war. The law firm Robert chose had a reputation for being aggressive and ruthless. They were known for taking on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch and for using every legal trick in the book to get what they wanted. The lead attorney, Janet Miller, was exactly the kind of person Robert needed for his plan. Janet had been practicing law for 20 years and had made a career out of intimidating people who couldn't afford to fight back. She knew how to write letters that sounded official and scary, even when the legal basis was questionable. Her specialty was making people believe they were in serious legal trouble, whether they actually were or not. The first letter from Janet's law firm arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as Maria was finishing up her daily chores around the ranch. The envelope was thick and official-looking, with the law firm's name printed in bold letters across the top. Maria's hands shook slightly as she opened it, knowing that whatever was inside would be much more serious than the previous complaints. The letter was 4 pages long and filled with complex legal language that Maria barely understood. But the main message was clear enough. The law firm claimed that recent city ordinances had given the HOA authority over all properties within their area of influence, which supposedly included Maria's ranch. The letter went on to say that Maria's property was in violation of multiple zoning laws and health codes. It claimed that keeping horses on residential property was illegal, and that her barn was a fire hazard that put the entire neighborhood at risk. The letter demanded that Maria remove all her animals within 30 days and convert her property to meet HOA standards. But the most shocking part was at the end. If Maria didn't comply within the 30-day deadline, the HOA would take legal action to have her property seized through something called eminent domain. Maria had heard this term before but wasn't exactly sure what it meant. All she knew was that it sounded like they were threatening to take away her family's land. Maria read the letter over and over, trying to understand all the legal terms. Words like municipal code violations, public nuisance, and property seizure jumped out at her. The letter referenced dozens of legal cases and city ordinances that she had never heard of. It all sounded very official and very scary. The weekend was torture for Maria. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and couldn't stop thinking about the letter. She walked around her ranch, looking at everything her grandfather had built and everything she had worked so hard to maintain. The idea of losing it all seemed impossible, but the legal letter made it sound like it was already decided. On Monday morning, Maria called in sick to work and spent the day trying to understand her legal situation. She searched online for information about eminent domain and property rights, but most of what she found was too complicated for her to understand. The legal websites used the same confusing language as the letter, making her feel even more overwhelmed. Meanwhile, Robert wasn't waiting around. He had organized a petition drive throughout the neighborhood, asking residents to sign a document demanding immediate action against Maria's dangerous and incompatible property use. He went door to door, explaining to neighbors how Maria's ranch was supposedly putting their children at risk and lowering their home values. The petition was cleverly written to make Maria sound like a serious threat to the community. It claimed that her horses were attracting dangerous wildlife, that her property was a fire hazard during dry seasons, and that her refusal to follow community standards was setting a bad example for other property owners. By the end of the week, Robert had collected over 60 signatures from concerned neighbors. But Robert didn't stop there. He contacted the local newspaper and convinced them to run a story about the property dispute in Oakwood Heights. The article was published on Wednesday, and while it tried to be balanced, it clearly favored the HOA side of the story. The headline read, "Neighborhood Divided Over Property Standards Dispute," and it included quotes from Robert about the importance of maintaining community values. The article described Maria as a long-time resident who has refused to work with neighborhood association to address community concerns. It mentioned the petition and quoted several neighbors who complained about noise, property values, and safety issues. Maria was given a chance to respond, but her simple statement that she had always tried to be a good neighbor seemed weak compared to Robert's detailed complaints. After the newspaper article came out, Maria's phone started ringing constantly. Some calls were from reporters wanting to interview her, but most were from people she didn't know who had read the article and wanted to share their opinions. Some callers were supportive, but others were mean and angry, telling her she should just sell her property and move somewhere else. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Maria had always been a private person who just wanted to live peacefully on her family's land. Now she felt like she was under a microscope, with everyone in town having an opinion about her situation. She stopped going to the grocery store and the feed store because she was tired of people staring at her and whispering. The final blow came when Maria received another letter from the law firm, this time with even more serious threats. The letter informed her that the HOA was prepared to file a lawsuit in court, seeking immediate eviction and property seizure. They gave her just 72 hours to respond or face a default judgment, which would mean she would automatically lose the case. Maria stared at the letter in disbelief. 72 hours to respond to something this serious seemed impossible. It was Friday afternoon, and most lawyers would be closed over the weekend. How was she supposed to find legal help and prepare a response in such a short time? That night, Maria sat in her grandfather's old study, surrounded by boxes of family documents and legal papers. She felt completely alone and overwhelmed. The ranch that had been her sanctuary for 15 years now felt like a prison. She wondered if her grandfather had ever imagined that someone might try to take away the land he had worked so hard to buy and maintain. As she sat there feeling sorry for herself, Maria's eyes fell on an old wooden filing cabinet in the corner of the room. She had never really looked through it carefully before, assuming it just contained old bills and receipts. But something made her curious tonight. Maybe there was something in there that could help her understand her legal situation better. Maria pulled open the first drawer and began looking through the yellowed papers and faded documents. What she found would change everything. Maria opened the old filing cabinet with trembling hands, not really expecting to find anything useful. The first drawer was filled with old receipts, tax records, and maintenance bills from decades ago. Her grandfather had been incredibly organized, keeping detailed records of every expense and repair on the ranch. But as Maria dug deeper, she started finding documents that looked much more important. In the back of the second drawer, wrapped in a faded manila envelope, she found a stack of official-looking papers with red wax seals and fancy lettering. These weren't just any documents. They were the original property deeds from when her grandfather first bought the land in the 1960s. Maria had seen copies of some of these papers before, but these originals contained much more detail than she remembered. As she carefully unfolded the yellowed papers, Maria's eyes widened in shock. According to the documents, her grandfather hadn't just bought the 50 acres where the ranch sat. He had actually purchased nearly 200 acres of land in total, almost 4 times more than she had ever realized. The property boundaries shown on the old survey maps extended far beyond what she thought belonged to her family. Maria spread the papers out on her grandfather's old desk and tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The original parcel included not just her ranch, but large portions of what was now the Oakwood Heights development. Over the years, her grandfather had sold off pieces of this land to various developers, but he had been very careful about how he did it. Each sale came with detailed contracts and restrictions. Her grandfather was clearly a smart businessman who understood the importance of protecting his interests. As Maria read through the contracts, she discovered that he had included special clauses in every sale that protected his remaining property from any future homeowner associations or neighborhood rules. But the biggest shock was yet to come. As Maria examined a detailed survey map from 1987, she noticed something that made her heart race. A small section of land near the center of what was now Oakwood Heights was highlighted in red ink, with her grandfather's handwriting noting, "Retained, not for sale." This 5-acre plot was exactly where the HOA Community Center now stood. Maria stared at the map in disbelief. Could it really be true? Did she actually own the land underneath the very building that Robert Stone was using as his headquarters to attack her? She looked at the map again and again, comparing it to her memory of the neighborhood layout. There was no doubt about it. The community center was sitting on land that still belonged to her family. Her hands shaking with excitement, Maria searched through more documents to confirm what she was seeing. She found the deed transfer papers from when the community center was built 5 years ago. The construction company had somehow obtained permits and built the building without ever checking who actually owned the land underneath it. They had simply assumed that because it was in the middle of the development, it must belong to the HOA. Maria realized that all these years, the HOA had been paying property taxes on a building they didn't actually have the right to occupy. They had been holding their meetings, storing their equipment, and conducting their business on her property without her permission. The irony was incredible. Robert Stone had been using her own land as a base of operations to try to kick her off her ranch, but there was even more. As Maria continued reading through her grandfather's carefully organized files, she discovered that several of the property sales in the 1980s and 1990s had included restrictive covenants that were still legally binding. These covenants specifically stated that no homeowner association formed on the sold land could have any authority over the original ranch property or any land retained by her grandfather. This meant that everything the HOA had been doing, all the complaints, fines, and legal threats, was completely illegal. They had no authority over her property whatsoever. Not only that, but they had been operating their organization from land they didn't own, collecting fees and fines based on rules they had no right to enforce. Maria felt a mix of emotions washing over her: relief, anger, excitement, and determination all at once. For weeks she had felt powerless and alone, facing what seemed like an impossible legal battle. Now she realized that she wasn't the one in trouble. Robert Stone and his HOA were the ones who had been breaking the law all along. The next morning, Maria called in sick to work again and spent the entire day on the phone trying to find the right lawyer to help her. She needed someone who specialized in property law and had experience dealing with these kinds of complex ownership issues. After calling dozens of law firms, she finally found attorney David Chen, who agreed to meet with her that afternoon. David's office was small and cluttered, nothing like the fancy law firm that the HOA had hired. But when Maria spread out all of her grandfather's documents on his desk, David's eyes lit up with interest. He had been practicing property law for 15 years, but he had never seen a case quite like this one. For 2 hours, David carefully examined every document Maria had brought. He asked detailed questions about the timeline of events and took notes on everything the HOA had done. When he finally finished reviewing all the papers, he leaned back in his chair with a big smile on his face. "Maria," he said, "this is absolutely incredible. Not only do you have a strong defense against their lawsuit, but you have grounds for a massive countersuit. They've been harassing you illegally, operating without proper authority, and trespassing on your property for years." David explained that the restrictive covenants her grandfather had included in the property sales were ironclad. Any lawyer worth their salt should have discovered these restrictions before filing the lawsuit against her. The fact that they had missed such important legal documents suggested either incompetence or deliberate misconduct. But the best part was the community center situation. David confirmed that Maria absolutely owned the land underneath the building. The HOA had been occupying her property without permission, which in legal terms was called trespassing. She had every right to demand that they vacate the building immediately. Instead of just defending against the HOA's lawsuit, David suggested they go on the offensive. They would file their own lawsuit demanding damages for harassment, trespassing, and emotional distress. They would also seek an injunction to stop the HOA from any further interference with Maria's property rights. Most importantly, they would demand that the HOA either negotiate a proper lease agreement for the community center land or vacate the building within 60 days. Maria would finally have the power to make Robert Stone's life as difficult as he had made hers. As Maria left David's office that evening, she felt lighter than she had in months. Tomorrow, they would file their countersuit and turn the tables on Robert Stone and his army of lawyers. The ranch that her grandfather had worked so hard to protect would remain in the family, and justice would finally be served. The war wasn't over yet, but now Maria knew she was going to win. The day of the court hearing arrived faster than Maria expected. She had spent the previous week working with David to prepare their case, organizing all the documents and evidence they needed. For the first time in months, Maria felt confident and ready to fight back. She put on her best suit and drove to the courthouse, knowing that today would change everything. Robert Stone arrived at the courthouse looking as confident as ever. He had brought his entire legal team, including Janet Miller and 2 other lawyers carrying briefcases full of papers. They sat up at their table like they were preparing for battle, spreading out documents and whispering among themselves. Robert kept glancing over at Maria with a smug expression, clearly expecting an easy victory. The courtroom was packed with people from the neighborhood who had come to watch the drama unfold. Some were there to support Robert and the HOA, while others were curious to see what would happen. Maria recognized many faces from Oakwood Heights, including several people who had signed the petition against her. When Judge Williams called the case to order, Janet Miller stood up first to present the HOA's case. She spoke for nearly 30 minutes using complicated legal language to argue that Maria's ranch was a public nuisance that needed to be removed for the good of the community. She showed photographs of Maria's property and read from city ordinances that she claimed supported their position. Janet was clearly experienced at this kind of presentation. She made everything sound very official and convincing, talking about property values and community standards. Several people in the courtroom nodded along as she spoke, and Maria started to feel nervous again. Maybe she had been too optimistic about her chances. But then it was David's turn to speak, and everything changed. Instead of responding to the HOA's arguments, David calmly walked over to a large easel he had set up near the judge's bench. He placed a huge copy of the original 1960s survey map on the easel, showing the full extent of Maria's grandfather's original property purchase. "Your Honor," David began in a clear, strong voice, "before we discuss any alleged violations, we need to establish who actually has the legal authority to make these claims." He used a pointer to show the original property boundaries, which extended far beyond what anyone in the courtroom had expected. The room fell silent as David methodically explained how Maria's grandfather had purchased nearly 200 acres and had carefully retained certain rights when he sold portions of the land. He showed the judge copies of the original deeds and pointed out the restrictive covenants that protected Maria's ranch from any HOA authority. But the real bombshell came when David placed a second map on the easel, this one showing the current layout of Oakwood Heights. With a red marker, he circled the exact location of the HOA Community Center and explained that this building was sitting on land that still belonged to Maria. The judge leaned forward in his chair, studying the maps carefully. "Are you telling me that the plaintiff's organization is operating from a building on the defendant's property?" he asked. "That's exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor," David replied. "Not only does the HOA have no authority over Ms. Rodriguez's ranch, but they have been trespassing on her property for the past 5 years. Maria watched Robert's face as the reality of the situation hit him. His confident smirk disappeared, replaced by a look of shock and growing panic. He whispered frantically to Janet Miller, who was flipping through her papers with increasing desperation. David wasn't finished. He presented evidence showing that the HOA had been operating illegally in several ways. Their incorporation papers contained errors, their claimed boundaries were invalid, and they had been collecting fees and fines from property owners who weren't actually subject to their authority. The judge asked Janet Miller if she wanted to respond to these revelations. She stood up slowly, clearly struggling to find something to say. "Your Honor, we were not aware of these historical property issues. We acted in good faith based on the information available to us." But Judge Williams was not impressed. "Counselor, it's your responsibility to research property ownership before filing lawsuits. These documents are all matters of public record that should have been discovered during basic due diligence." The judge spent several minutes reviewing the evidence that David had presented. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the sound of pages turning and the occasional whisper. Maria could feel her heart pounding as she waited for the decision that would determine her future. Finally, Judge Williams looked up and delivered his ruling. "The plaintiff's lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice," he announced. "Furthermore, I am awarding the defendant damages for harassment and legal fees in the amount of $15,000. But he wasn't done yet. "Given that the plaintiff's organization has been operating from a building on the defendant's property without permission, I am issuing an injunction requiring them to either negotiate a proper lease agreement or vacate the premises within 60 days. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs and gasps. Maria felt tears of relief streaming down her face as the weight of months of stress and worry finally lifted from her shoulders. David reached over and squeezed her hand, smiling broadly at their complete victory. Robert Stone looked like he had been hit by a truck. He sat in stunned silence as people around him whispered and pointed. Several HOA board members who had attended the hearing quickly got up and left, clearly wanting to distance themselves from the disaster. Within a week of the court ruling, Robert Stone had resigned as HOA president and put his house up for sale. He left town quietly, never speaking publicly about what had happened. Janet Miller faced an investigation by the State Bar Association for filing frivolous lawsuits without proper research. The new HOA leadership reached out to Maria immediately, apologizing for everything that had happened and asking if they could work out a reasonable lease agreement for the community center. Maria, feeling generous in victory, agreed to lease them the land for just $1 per year, with one important condition. The HOA had to establish a good neighbor policy preventing harassment of any property owner whose land use predated the subdivision. Today, Maria's ranch thrives peacefully alongside Oakwood Heights. The new HOA leadership focuses on genuine community improvements rather than harassing neighbors. Maria has even allowed them to use part of her pasture for community events, and several neighborhood children take riding lessons at her ranch. The case became famous in legal circles as an example of the importance of understanding property rights and the dangers of HOA overreach. Maria's story proves that sometimes, standing your ground and knowing your rights can lead to justice, even when facing overwhelming opposition. Maria still lives on her family's ranch, surrounded by the rolling hills and peaceful pastures that her grandfather loved so much. Every morning she sits on the same porch where he used to drink his coffee, grateful that she fought to protect the land that means so much to her family. The community center still operates on her property, but now it serves as a reminder that bullies don't always win, and that sometimes the little guy can triumph against all odds.